In the quiet town of Pine Hill, dawn never came hurriedly, but rather it crept over the rooftops with the gentleness of a mother pulling a blanket over her child. The sun often rose shyly, painting the wooden shutters with hues of orange, casting a faint glow across streets that still carried the dew of night. The cobblestone paths twisted like lines in an old hand, leading from one corner of life to another, each turn carrying its own tale. Merchants were already awake at first light, their stalls stacked with baskets of apples that glistened with freshness, loaves of bread still steaming from stone ovens, and pots of butter wrapped neatly in cloth. To an outsider, Pine Hill might have seemed like nothing more than a sleepy hamlet, but to those who lived there, it was the very world itself. Here people measured wealth not only by coins, but also by how loudly neighbors spoke their names and how proudly families carried their lineage. Yet among the many, there lived a woman who considered herself more than just a part of Pine Hill. She believed she was the very jewel of it. Her name was Caroline. She moved about the town with steps rehearsed as though she were walking upon a grand stage, each footfall echoing her belief that the earth itself should be grateful to bear her weight. Caroline's clothing was never modest. She wore gowns stitched with threads so rich they seemed to drink in the light, and when she turned, the hems of her dresses swept the ground like waves chasing after the shore. Around her neck dangled chains of silver and pendants shaped like teardrops, glittering with every tilt of her chin. It was said her shoes were polished by hands that were not her own, and even the heels clicked against the cobblestones as though announcing her arrival before her lips could. To see her stride through the marketplace was to witness both fascination and fear. Fascination because she represented the idea of wealth that many secretly longed for. Fear because her tongue was as sharp as broken glass and her temper flared without warning. She spoke to others not as though they were companions in life, but as though they were mere servants in a play she alone directed. Children quieted when she passed, mothers pulled them close, and fathers kept their eyes low. She relished it, every bowed head, every nervous glance, every whisper that followed her, whether in praise or in resentment. Better, she thought, to be feared and envied than to be ignored like dust upon a shelf. What she never considered was that dust often outlasts the finest silk, and envy never feeds the soul. But pride has a way of closing ears to wisdom, and Caroline, wrapped in her illusions, walked as though time itself owed her allegiance. Not far from the path where Caroline often strutted, there lived Evelyn, a woman of very different measure. If Caroline was the storm, Evelyn was the quiet that followed, the kind of stillness where you could hear your own heartbeat and the distant call of sparrows. She did not live in a house with tall fences or servants bustling in and out. Instead, her home was a modest wooden cottage, its walls painted in colors once bright but now faded by years of sun and rain. The porch held a rocking chair that creaked when touched by the evening breeze, and the yard carried the scent of lavender she had planted by her own hands. Evelyn's clothes were simple, often made from cloth she stitched herself, her fingers calloused from both work and care. Her shoes bore scuffs from long walks along the stony paths, yet she wore them with grace, never embarrassed by what others might call worn. Unlike Caroline, Evelyn carried no jewels upon her body, but her face glowed with something money could not purchase. She greeted her neighbors with warmth, sharing apples when her basket was full and offering bread when she had more than she needed. Some pitied her, believing her to be poor, for their eyes measured her by her garments and her humble dwelling. They saw only what glittered upon Caroline and assumed that wealth was proof of greatness. But Evelyn carried treasures unseen. When night cloaked Pine Hill in silence, and the last lanterns in the marketplace were snuffed out, Evelyn would kneel by her bed, her hands folded tightly, her eyes closed. She prayed with words gentle yet steady, sending them upward like smoke from a candle. "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want," she whispered, not out of habit, but out of belief that pierced bone and marrow. While others chased approval, Evelyn chased presence, the nearness of a God she trusted more than coin or reputation. And though she lacked servants or silver, she possessed a quiet richness that could not be measured in weights or scales. She prayed for Pine Hill, she prayed for those who overlooked her, and she prayed even for Caroline, though Caroline had given her no reason to. Some nights, tears trickled down her cheeks, not from despair, but from a longing to walk closer to the divine, a longing that grew as deep as roots gripping the earth. And though few noticed, heaven did. For prayer is not measured by who hears it on earth, but by the one who gathers it above. Caroline often crossed paths with Evelyn, and whenever she did, a sneer would rise unbidden on her lips. To Caroline, Evelyn's simplicity was not virtue but weakness, a glaring insult to the scale by which she measured worth. She could not comprehend how a woman could walk with her chin steady while wearing dresses so plain, or how one could smile without wealth to fuel the glow. To Caroline's eyes, Evelyn was nothing but a shadow among brighter lights, a face among faces that did not deserve to be remembered. "She does not even know her place," Caroline often muttered under her breath, her words dripping with scorn. Yet there was something about Evelyn that unsettled her, though she would never admit it. It was the way Evelyn's eyes carried peace, like calm water untouched by the wind, even when mockery buzzed around her. It was the way she moved without haste, as though she was not racing to prove herself, as though she had already found what the rest of Pine Hill was still chasing. Caroline hated that serenity because it reminded her of a truth she refused to face, that peace cannot be bought with coins or silks. She believed power rested in who commanded the loudest voice, but Evelyn lived by another rhythm, one that drew from Scripture. Better is little with the fear of the Lord than great treasure and trouble therewith. Evelyn often recited to herself from Proverbs, her lips moving quietly as she worked. Her prayers became her shield against gossip, her anchor against loneliness, her oil against the rust of despair. She had no hunger for applause, no thirst for revenge. She only longed to remain faithful. Caroline could not see it, but Evelyn's strength was like the roots of an old oak tree, invisible on the surface, yet gripping deep beneath the soil, holding firm against storms that others could not endure. To some, Evelyn was invisible, but to heaven, her prayers rang louder than any shout Caroline could make in the marketplace. The difference between the two women grew sharper with every passing day, though most of Pine Hill was too occupied with their own affairs to notice. Caroline, adorned with her jewels and lifted by her arrogance, believed herself untouchable, higher than the very roofs of the town. She relished the murmurs of envy, convinced that such whispers were proof of her greatness. Yet pride is like a candle. It glows brightly, but consumes itself in silence until all that remains is smoke. Evelyn, meanwhile, continued to walk in simplicity, her heart tethered to promises unseen. She did not envy Caroline's gowns or covet her silver. She carried her worth not in what she wore, but in whom she trusted. And though she looked small in the eyes of many, her faith was a fortress none could break. The townsfolk, busy with their gossip and trades, had not yet glimpsed the turning of events that life was preparing. They did not know that the same Caroline, who walked as though the ground itself belonged to her, would soon stumble, nor that the same Evelyn who lived quietly in her cottage would stand before them in honor. For now, Pine Hill continued as always, bread baked in ovens, gossip carried through windows, Caroline strutting like a queen, Evelyn whispering prayers like incense. But the heavens unseen were already moving, for crowns built of pride grow heavy, and hearts bowed in prayer are lifted in due time. And though no one in Pine Hill could yet imagine it, the day was approaching when mud and dignity would collide, and the town would never again look at Caroline or Evelyn in the same way. The sky above Pine Hill on that afternoon carried the heaviness of unspoken secrets. Clouds, thick and gray, rolled slowly like tired cattle across the heavens, threatening rain that had already kissed the earth the night before. The ground was slick with mud, its surface marked by wagon wheels and hurried footsteps of those who had crossed the churchyard earlier in the day. It was a community event, the sort that gathered nearly every soul in Pine Hill, whether for fellowship, curiosity, or the simple joy of leaving their homes. Men in wool coats stood in small clusters, their hats damp from the drizzle, while women in shawls gathered under trees, trading news with lowered voices and darting glances. Children splashed in puddles despite their mother's scolding, their laughter ringing through the air like tiny bells trying to outsing the gloom. And then came Caroline, her entrance not subtle but sharp, like a knife drawn from a sheath. She wore a crimson coat that seemed to defy the gray sky, her boots gleaming, though the ground threatened to soil them. Her steps were deliberate, her chin tilted upward, as though she could command the very clouds to part at her will. Eyes turned, whispers stirred, and though not every word reached her ears, Caroline felt the familiar rush of satisfaction. She was the storm amid drizzle, the flame in the cold, and she reveled in it. As she walked, she glanced at faces with practiced disdain, her lips curling in a smirk that promised she had come not merely to attend, but to dominate. Among the crowd stood Evelyn, near the stone steps of the church, her posture relaxed, though her dress was damp from the misty air. She held no umbrella, no bright color to shield her from the dullness of the day, only her quiet demeanor that seemed oddly fitting beneath the weeping sky. Caroline's eyes fell upon her, and a dangerous thought sparked, an opportunity to remind Pine Hill that even in mud, she, Caroline, would remain untarnished while others could be dragged low. It was not enough to be admired, she longed to be feared. The air thickened as her eyes fixed on Evelyn, and the crowd, sensing something unsaid, began to hush, as though the heavens themselves were holding their breath. Caroline moved toward Evelyn with the prowl of a lioness circling prey, each step echoing against the wet cobblestones. Her crimson coat flared at her sides like a banner of war, drawing more eyes to her than she could have asked for. As she approached, the conversation around the churchyard softened to murmurs, then to silence, until even the children's laughter dimmed. Caroline thrived in that silence. It was her stage, and she was ready to perform. Standing before Evelyn, she let her gaze sweep over the woman's faded dress, the mud already licking at the hem from standing too long on wet earth. "Well, if it isn't our shadow of Pine Hill," Caroline declared, her voice carrying across the square. "Tell me, Evelyn, do mirrors in your home refuse to speak, or do you simply not own one?" A ripple of nervous laughter broke through the crowd, some voices forced, others hesitant, for no one wished to be the target of Caroline's venom. Evelyn did not answer. Her eyes remained calm, her hands folded gently before her, as though she were a child in prayer. That silence unnerved Caroline, who expected tears, shame, or even an outburst she could mock. Instead, she found herself standing before still waters that reflected her malice back at her. "No words?" Caroline sneered, louder this time, as if to rattle her opponent. "Perhaps silence suits you better. Let me give you something else to carry home with you." Without warning, Caroline thrust her hand against Evelyn's shoulder. The force, sudden and merciless, sent Evelyn stumbling backward. Her body crumpled into the mud with a sound both soft and sickening, a splash that marked not only her dress but her dignity in the eyes of those who watched. Gasps burst from the crowd, a chorus of disbelief that mingled with the drizzle of rain. Evelyn did not fight, did not scream. She sat in the mud, her dress stained, her hair undone, her hands trembling slightly as she steadied herself. Caroline's laughter rose, cruel and sharp, slicing through the silence. She stood tall, convinced she had triumphed, that humiliation was the crown she had placed upon Evelyn's head. But the crowd saw more than Caroline realized. While she stood gloating, Evelyn's response carried a weight no mockery could overshadow. Slowly, with deliberate calm, Evelyn lifted her eyes, not to Caroline, not even to the onlookers, but heavenward. Mud clung to her skin, rain mingled with her tears, though whether from sorrow or from the sting of the cold no one could say, and her lips parted in a whisper. "Father, forgive her, for she knows not what she does." The words, borrowed from the Savior on the cross, rolled softly yet heavily through the stillness. Those close enough to hear felt their hearts shift. Even those further away sensed the gravity in her quiet prayer. She did not raise her fists, she did not curse, she did not accuse. Instead, she called upon heaven with a grace that exposed the pettiness of Caroline's cruelty. A man near the front removed his hat, though he could not explain why. A woman gripped her shawl tighter, her eyes filling with unbidden tears. Children, confused, clutched their mother's skirts, sensing something sacred yet unspoken. Caroline's laughter wavered for a moment, as if caught off guard by the strength hidden in those whispered words. But pride, stubborn as stone, quickly covered her unease, and she lifted her chin higher. Pray all you wish, she scoffed. Even God cannot wash away mud so quickly. Yet her voice betrayed a tremor, one small crack in the armor she wore so proudly. Evelyn, however, did not look at her again. She steadied herself, rising slowly from the ground, her back straight, her dignity intact though her dress was ruined. Mud dripped from her hem as she stepped aside, her silence and prayer more powerful than any weapon she could have wielded. Caroline remained standing in the square, but the eyes that turned toward her were no longer filled with admiration. They carried questions, doubts, even unease, for they had seen pride clash with humility and had witnessed which one had truly stood taller. Evelyn's walk away from the churchyard was not hurried. Each step seemed deliberate, as though she refused to let the mud dictate her pace. Behind her, whispers began to rise like wind in tall grass, soft at first, then spreading in waves through the gathered crowd. Some pitied her, shaken by the cruelty they had just witnessed. Others lowered their gaze, ashamed they had laughed at Caroline's mockery even for a moment. A few, silent and thoughtful, carried the prayer Evelyn had whispered deep into their hearts, repeating it silently as though it had been spoken for them as well. Caroline tried to stand proud, tried to wear the mask of victory, but something in the air had shifted. Her laughter no longer rang as triumph, but as hollow notes on a broken instrument. She adjusted her coat, brushed a speck of mud from her sleeve, and forced a smile, but the murmurs around her no longer fed her pride, they starved it. She had pushed Evelyn into the mud thinking to bury her, but the woman's prayer had risen like incense, leaving Caroline exposed. Evelyn reached her cottage at last, slipping quietly inside, her wet dress clinging to her skin. She lit a lamp, its glow filling the small room with warmth, and sank to her knees beside her bed. The words came easily. Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, in you will I trust. Psalm 91 verse 2 rolled from her lips as though it had been written for that very moment. She prayed not only for strength but for Caroline, whose cruelty came from a heart chained by pride. Outside, the rain fell harder, washing over Pine Hill, cleansing the streets and soaking the earth. Inside, Evelyn prayed, and in that prayer lay the quiet power that no shove into mud could diminish. The town of Pine Hill was never without its whispers, and after the incident in the churchyard, those whispers grew wings. They spread from the bakery, where flour dust hung in the air like morning fog, to the shoemaker's shop, where leather scraps curled on the floor like dried leaves. Conversations no longer revolved solely around the price of wool or the quality of cider. Instead, people leaned close, lowering their voices, as they spoke about the sight of Evelyn sitting in the mud while Caroline's laughter rose above the drizzle. Men who prided themselves on being steady now found themselves uneasy, for they could not shake the image of a woman humiliated and yet unbroken. Women who often looked to Caroline with both envy and dread now measured her differently, their admiration dimming like a lamp low on oil. Even the children carried the story, repeating it to each other in games and rhymes, exaggerating the splash of the mud or the sharpness of Caroline's voice. The tale lived not only in words, but in the silence that followed whenever Evelyn walked by. People watched her closely, expecting bitterness, expecting a tremor of anger or the heavy gaze of resentment. Yet none came. She moved as though the incident had never happened, her footsteps steady, her smile intact. That composure unsettled them more than tears would have, for tears would have confirmed weakness, but silence cloaked in dignity felt like strength. Some dared to call it grace, though they said it quietly, for fear that Caroline's sharp ears might catch their admiration. Pine Hill was learning, though not all at once, that the difference between the two women was not a matter of clothing or coin, but something deeper, harder to measure, and impossible to counterfeit. Evelyn's house became a kind of silent witness to this unfolding change. In the evenings, after her day's work was done, she lit her lamp and allowed its glow to soften the small wooden walls. She cooked simple meals, bread warmed on iron pans, and stews simmering with carrots and beans gathered from her garden. Alone, she was not lonely, for she spoke often in prayer, her words filling the empty corners with a presence greater than herself. Lord, you are my refuge and my fortress, my God, in you I trust, she whispered one evening, repeating the words from Psalm 91, with a conviction that made her voice tremble. She prayed for Pine Hill, for the mothers who worried about their children, for the men who toiled long hours, for the shopkeepers who struggled when trade was thin. And yes, she prayed for Caroline, not with malice, but with a plea for mercy. Her prayers were not a rehearsed chant, but a conversation, a dialogue between her heart and the heavens. She asked not for riches nor for revenge, but for the strength to remain gentle, the wisdom to walk in humility, and the grace to forgive those who wounded her. At times she prayed with tears, at other times with quiet confidence, but always with the belief that her words did not vanish into the ceiling, but traveled upward, collected by a God who saw what others ignored. Outside her window, the world carried on, horses stamping their hooves against the damp ground, laughter spilling from the tavern, the creak of carts returning from fields. But inside her home, the air was charged with the unseen. The power of prayer gave her what the world could not: a shield against bitterness, a balm against shame, and a peace that held her steady when pride tried to shake her. Meanwhile, Caroline lived as though the event had already been erased, but her heart carried its own shadows. She still walked the streets with her head high, her coats brighter than the season's flowers. But she felt the change in the air. Where once people's admiration had been laced with envy, now their glances carried a trace of doubt, and she hated it. She dismissed it with sharper words, louder laughter, and grander displays of wealth, but none of it returned her the same satisfaction as before. She convinced herself that Evelyn's silence was proof of weakness, yet in quiet moments, when mirrors reflected her own eyes back at her, she remembered the prayer Evelyn had whispered from the mud. "Father, forgive her." The words rang louder than her own laughter, echoing in her mind like a bell that refused to be silenced. Pride urged her to bury it, to scoff at it, to declare herself victorious, but deep inside, where arrogance could not reach, a seed of unease had been planted. At night, when storms rumbled over Pine Hill and rain hammered her shutters, she sometimes wondered if Evelyn's prayer had been heard by someone greater than the crowd. She wondered why those words unsettled her so deeply, why they carried more weight than the stares of dozens of neighbors. Caroline told herself she was untouchable, yet she felt as though something unseen was drawing a line she could not cross without consequence. But she would not speak it aloud, for to admit it would mean acknowledging that humility had a power her pride could not compete with. The town itself seemed to hold its breath in the days that followed. Pine Hill was not large, and news traveled faster than carts on open roads. Whispers of Evelyn's composure and Caroline's cruelty became threads woven into the fabric of daily conversation. At the well, women spoke of it while filling their buckets, their voices dropping when others approached. At the mill, men shook their heads, remembering the sight of Evelyn rising from the mud with her dignity untouched. Even in the tavern, where laughter usually drowned out seriousness, the story found its way into hushed corners, as if the memory carried a weight that demanded reverence. Some said Evelyn's silence had been more powerful than any defense. Others claimed her whispered prayer had pierced the heavens and returned with unseen strength. Scripture began to circle quietly through the town. Pride goeth before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. The verse from Proverbs became a quiet refrain, passed among those who wondered if Pine Hill had just witnessed the beginning of such a fall. Caroline, still strutting, refused to believe her grip on the town was loosening, but those who once feared her now measured her differently. Evelyn, meanwhile, carried on as though none of it mattered, her prayers lifting each night, her hands steady in her work. She neither defended herself nor sought to remind others of her humiliation. Yet her silence spoke louder than words, her faith steadier than argument. The town watched, waiting, sensing that something larger was unfolding, something that went beyond mud, beyond laughter, beyond pride and shame. The balance in Pine Hill was shifting, and though no one could yet see how, they knew that time itself was preparing to reveal the hidden weight of both women's choices. The talk of a mall being built at the edge of Pine Hill began like a rumor, a whisper exchanged between neighbors leaning over fences, then grew into a steady current that carried itself into every home, shop, and gathering place in the town. At first, no one believed it, for Pine Hill was small and accustomed to little more than the familiar, its markets, its taverns, its churchyard gatherings. A mall seemed too grand, too far-fetched, something meant for larger towns with bustling roads and endless visitors. But the signs of change could not be ignored. Wagons came into Pine Hill, not filled with produce or cloth, but with heavy beams, stacks of glass, and stones cut with precision. Men unfamiliar to the town arrived with tools strapped to their belts, their hammers echoing through the fields as they laid the foundation for something unlike anything Pine Hill had ever seen. Slowly, a great structure rose, its walls pushing against the skyline, its windows glinting even in pale light. Children gathered at the edges of the construction site, their eyes wide, marveling at the scale of it all. Mothers shook their heads in disbelief. Fathers muttered about what this would mean, and shopkeepers worried if their small stalls could survive against the promise of something so grand. Yet curiosity outweighed fear, and Pine Hill buzzed with anticipation. Caroline, especially, basked in the thought of it. To her, the mall was not merely a building, but a new stage, larger than the churchyard, brighter than the marketplace, where she could strut before more eyes than ever before. She told anyone who would listen that she would be the first to walk through its doors, that no one would dare outshine her on that day. She spent hours envisioning what she would wear, what she would say, how she would stand at the center like a jewel set in gold. She believed the mall would elevate her further, cementing her place as Pine Hill's emblem of wealth and superiority. What she never considered was that the story being woven was not hers to direct, and the threads of destiny were moving quietly, unseen, preparing to unveil truths that would unmask pride and honor humility. The day of the grand opening arrived with the freshness of spring, though the air carried a crispness that hinted of change. From early morning, Pine Hill stirred like a hive of bees shaken from slumber. Families dressed in their best garments, pressing coats until they lay smooth, tying ribbons in children's hair, polishing shoes until they gleamed. The streets filled with chatter, not the hushed kind reserved for gossip, but a chorus of expectation, eager to witness something historic. The mall stood at the edge of town like a giant among cottages, its doors tall and carved with artistry, its windows polished until they mirrored the sky. Banners waved in the breeze, their colors vivid against the stone walls, proclaiming the opening day as a triumph. Musicians tuned their instruments, their notes carrying merriment, and the mayor, flushed with pride, rehearsed his speech aloud as he paced nervously. Caroline prepared with the same precision she had always shown in her efforts to command attention. Her gown, stitched from the finest velvet, shimmered when she turned. Jewels sparkled at her wrists and throat, catching the light in flashes that demanded admiration. She wore a hat with feathers that brushed the air dramatically with each step, and her boots, polished to perfection, clicked against the stones with every movement. She arrived at the mall with her chin raised, her smile practiced, her laughter loud enough to remind all around her that she considered herself the jewel of Pine Hill. Crowds parted slightly when she walked past, not out of true reverence, but out of habit, for her presence had long demanded space. She reveled in it, drinking in every glance, believing this day was her coronation. The crowd's murmurs fed her vanity, and she waited impatiently for the mayor to speak, eager to bask in the glory of being the first to step inside. Yet beneath the polished surface of her triumph, the earth trembled with a truth about to rise, one she could not yet fathom. The mayor finally stood before the people, his voice booming as he spoke of progress, of growth, of the promise the mall would bring. He described it as a beacon of prosperity, a place that would draw others to Pine Hill, a step forward into a brighter future. Applause rose like waves against the shore, hands clapping, voices cheering, children jumping in delight at the grandeur of the moment. Caroline clapped too, but her eyes were fixed on the entrance, her thoughts consumed not by his words, but by the moment she would claim. And then, the mayor paused, his expression shifting into one of reverence as he spoke again, his tone deeper, carrying the weight of revelation. "It is my honor," he said, "to introduce to you the one who has made all of this possible, the very owner of this mall, whose vision and dedication have given Pine Hill this gift. The crowd hushed, leaning forward, curiosity thick in the air. Caroline's heart raced. She imagined her own name, her own grandeur being confirmed in front of all. But as the mayor extended his hand toward the steps, Evelyn appeared. She stepped forward in a dress of gentle grace, not flashy, not loud, but woven with a quiet dignity that made her glow. Her hair caught the sunlight, her face radiant not with jewels but with peace. The crowd gasped, the sound rolling through the gathering like thunder after lightning. Evelyn, the woman Caroline had shoved into mud, the woman dismissed as poor and weak, was now standing as the rightful owner of the grandest building Pine Hill had ever known. Caroline's smile froze, her laughter caught in her throat, her body stiffened as though struck by cold wind. Around her, the eyes that once followed her with admiration turned now toward Evelyn, their gaze filled with wonder, respect, and something close to awe. Caroline had thought the day would crown her pride, but instead it unraveled her illusions thread by thread, leaving her exposed under the same sky that had once shielded her arrogance. Evelyn walked forward with steps steady as a hymn, her presence commanding not by force, but by the gravity of humility revealed in its true strength. She did not bask in the crowd's astonishment, nor did she look toward Caroline, whose figure now seemed smaller than it ever had before. She simply took her place beside the mayor, lifting her chin not in pride, but in quiet assurance. The crowd erupted again, this time not with curiosity, but with praise, their cheers filling the air with a reverence that could not be fabricated. Evelyn raised her hand gently, and the voices softened, falling into silence as though the very air waited for her words. "My friends," she began, her voice carrying across the square with calm clarity, "this place was built not for vanity, nor for the lifting of one name above another, but as a blessing for Pine Hill, for its people, for the generations to come." Her words fell like rain on thirsty ground, soothing and steady. She spoke of kindness, of faith, of the unseen power of prayer that had guided her path. She spoke of how humility opens doors pride can never touch, and how true wealth lies not in garments or jewels, but in hearts aligned with truth. "The Lord sees not as man sees," she said gently. "Man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." At that, many bowed their heads, recalling the verse as though hearing it anew. Caroline, standing among the crowd, felt her knees weaken, not from exhaustion, but from shame that pressed heavier than any weight she had ever carried. For the first time she understood that the crown she had clung to was nothing but dust in the wind, while Evelyn stood clothed in something eternal, untouchable, and divine. The crowd that had gathered outside the mall stood in a silence so deep, it seemed even the air held its breath. All around, faces reflected awe, disbelief, and reflection, as if they were witnessing something greater than a mere unveiling of ownership. Evelyn's presence, at the front of the gathering, shifted the very weight of the moment, turning what had begun as a celebration of commerce into a revelation of character. She stood with composure, not boastful, not hurried, her hands resting gently at her sides as though she needed no grandeur to command respect. The mall behind her gleamed in the midday light, its glass catching reflections of the townsfolk, making them part of the very structure she now introduced. Yet it was not the building that captured their attention, it was Evelyn's calm voice rising steadily above the whispers. "Dear friends," she began, each syllable rolling out with a gentleness that made people lean forward lest they miss a word. "I have walked these streets with you, not as one higher, not as one beneath, but as one among you." A murmur passed through the crowd, for many had overlooked her, dismissed her as unimportant. And yet here she was, speaking not as one who had triumphed over them, but as one who belonged with them. Her words wrapped around their hearts like threads of light, weaving humility into their understanding. She paused, letting her gaze drift across familiar faces, her eyes neither condemning nor accusing, but carrying a weight of truth. "There are those who measure worth by what they wear, or by the silver they hold," she continued. "But the Lord does not see as man sees. For man looks at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." The verse from Samuel struck chords long buried, and people shifted uncomfortably, reminded of times they themselves had judged by shallow measures. Caroline, standing stiff among them, felt the verse pierce deeper than any dagger. for it echoed loudly against the hollowness of her own pride. As Evelyn's voice carried across the square, she spoke not as one eager to impress, but as a vessel pouring out what had been long stored in prayer and faith. It was not coin that built these walls, nor pride that raised these pillars, she said softly, but faith that carried me through long nights, in prayer that guided my steps when I knew not where to go. Her words did not tremble with uncertainty, but flowed with a quiet assurance that made them undeniable. She told them how she had walked through nights when doubt whispered louder than hope. Yet she knelt and prayed, trusting that God heard her voice, even when silence filled the room. She confessed that there had been times she felt unseen, but she remembered what was written, "Your Father who sees in secret will reward you openly." Her eyes glistened slightly as she spoke those words, not with vanity, but with gratitude, for she was living proof of that promise. The people listened with hearts open, many recalling their own moments of hidden struggle, their own whispered prayers uttered in darkness. For the first time, they saw Evelyn not as a woman overlooked, but as one lifted, not by man's hand, but by God's. Caroline, whose throat had once been full of mocking laughter, now found it dry, her lips pressed tight as Evelyn's testimony reverberated inside her chest. She remembered the day in the churchyard, the mud staining Evelyn's dress, the cruel words she had thrown like stones. And yet here was the same woman, not reminding the crowd of the insult, not pointing fingers, but speaking of faith, prayer, and forgiveness. The grace of it stung, sharper than rebuke, for it revealed how hollow pride truly was when sensed the enduring strength of humility. The mayor, once so proud of his own role in introducing them all, now stood slightly behind Evelyn, his eyes wide with admiration, recognizing that the day's significance had shifted beyond commerce into something eternal. Mothers clutched their children closer, whispering that they should remember these words, for they carried a wisdom deeper than trade or gold. Fathers who had once dismissed Evelyn as frail now felt a weight of respect pressing upon their hearts. The townsfolk were caught between the awe of what they witnessed and the sobering realization of how easily they had judged her in the past. Even those who had laughed in the churchyard when Caroline shoved Evelyn into the mud now lowered their heads, shame painting their faces as they realized how quickly they had sided with cruelty rather than compassion. Evelyn did not need to remind them. Her silence had already done so. Her prayer on that day echoed in their minds, the same prayer that revealed a heart far stronger than pride could ever be. Caroline felt her knees weaken beneath her gown, and for the first time in her life, she could not hold her head high. She lowered her gaze, not because anyone commanded her to, but because she could no longer bear the weight of looking upon Evelyn's face, radiant with peace. Her pride, once her armor, now felt like shackles that bound her, each link forged by her own vanity. The same people who had once admired her jewels and gowns now looked at her differently, not with fear or envy, but with pity, and that cut deeper than ridicule ever could. She trembled inwardly, knowing that her pride had met its match not in another boastful spirit, but in a quiet strength birthed from prayer. When Evelyn concluded, she did not speak of vengeance, nor did she lift herself above those who had despised her. Instead, she bowed her head slightly, her voice lowering to a tone of finality. "This place is not mine alone," she said. "It belongs to Pine Hill, to its people, to every soul who will walk through its doors. Let it stand as a reminder that prayer is never wasted, and that humility is a crown far greater than gold." Her words lingered in the air, heavy with meaning, before the crowd erupted into applause. Not the shallow clapping reserved for spectacle, but the deep, heartfelt sound of people moved to their very core. Tears glistened in eyes unused to weeping, voices cracked as they shouted her name, and in that chorus, Evelyn stood, not triumphant over Caroline, but lifted by the same faith that had sustained her when she knelt alone in her small cottage. Caroline remained silent, her jewels suddenly heavy, her coat suffocating, her feathers foolish against the weight of truth. She had strutted into the square believing the day was hers, but the true crown had settled on Evelyn, a crown unseen by man's eyes, yet undeniable in its radiance. And so Pine Hill witnessed the shift of power, not the rise of pride, but the vindication of prayer, the exaltation of humility, and the revelation that hearts bowed before God will always be lifted higher than those lifted by vanity. In the weeks that followed the unveiling, Pine Hill seemed to breathe differently. The streets that once carried the weight of gossip now carried the hum of something softer, something more reflective. The marketplace was still alive with the bartering of goods, the clatter of carts, and the chatter of families, but beneath the ordinary rhythm, a quiet change pulsed. People found themselves speaking more gently, choosing kindness where once they might have chosen scorn. It was as if Evelyn's words had seeped into the soil of Pine Hill, sprouting roots in every heart that had heard them. The mall itself became more than a place of trade. It was a symbol of hope, its tall windows shining like beacons whenever the sun touched them. Families visited not only to buy and sell, but to marvel at the reminder that dignity could rise from the mud. Children ran through its corridors wide-eyed, their laughter echoing against polished walls, and elders sat on benches near the fountain, speaking of how prayer had built more than stone, it had built courage. Evelyn was often seen walking quietly through the mall, not with grandeur, but with the same grace that had carried her through her trials. She greeted workers by name, thanked shopkeepers for their labor, and offered smiles to children tugging at their mothers' skirts. The people revered her not because she demanded it, but because she had become to them a living parable of faith's reward. Caroline, however, carried herself differently. She no longer swept into the square with the same thunderous steps or laughter that cut like glass. Her dresses were still fine, her jewels still gleamed, but they no longer had the power to command admiration. When she entered the mall for the first time, she did so quietly, her head lowered slightly, her voice subdued. Some whispered that she was avoiding Evelyn. Others thought she feared the reflection of her past. Whatever the reason, Caroline had learned that pride, when broken, does not repair easily, and arrogance, when exposed, carries scars that jewels cannot cover. Caroline's nights became longer than her days, for when the lamps were extinguished and silence filled her grand house, the shadows of her conscience grew loud. She would lie awake, staring at the ornate ceiling she once admired, yet now it felt like a mirror reflecting her emptiness. The laughter she had wielded so easily in the past now mocked her from memory, twisting in her chest like a thorn. She could not forget the sight of Evelyn rising from the mud, nor could she erase the words of prayer that had slipped from Evelyn's lips in that moment of humiliation. They returned to her again and again. "Father, forgive her." Those words had become a weight, pressing on her heart with every passing day. She tried to drown them with music, with gatherings, with the company of those who still flattered her, but none of it silenced the echo. Her pride had been her fortress, but the walls were cracked, and no matter how she tried to mend them with laughter or wealth, the cracks widened. For the first time in her life, she felt something she had long considered weakness: shame. Shame for her cruelty, shame for the fear she had sowed, shame for the arrogance that had blinded her to the value of humility. Some nights, she rose from her bed and walked to her window, gazing out at the mall that now glowed even in the starlight. She would whisper questions into the dark words that trembled on her lips. How did she stand so strong? How could she forgive me? The silence of her house gave her no answers, but deep within, she began to understand that strength such as Evelyn's did not come from wealth or from power, but from prayer. It was a realization that unsettled her, for she had never knelt in sincerity, never lifted her voice heavenward except to mock. And yet, the seed of longing began to grow within her heart, though pride still fought to choke it. Meanwhile, Evelyn continued in her rhythm of life, never changing her ways despite the honor she now carried. Each evening, after walking through the mall and greeting the townsfolk, she returned to her modest cottage, the lamp glowing warmly as though unchanged by her new station. She knelt as she had always done, her prayers steady, her voice low but filled with conviction. "Humble yourselves under the mighty hand of God, that he may exalt you in due time," she whispered, recalling the verse from Peter that had guided her heart through many storms. She prayed for the town that had once judged her, asking for unity and compassion to take root among its people. She prayed for children growing up in Pine Hill that they might learn to value character above appearances. And she prayed for Caroline, not with bitterness, but with the tenderness of one who knew that chains of pride are heavier than any shackles of iron. Evelyn's prayers were not grand speeches, but quiet conversations with the one she trusted, and through them she found peace that no insult could shake. Her humility became a mirror for Pine Hill, reminding its people daily that greatness is not found in towering words or glittering garments, but in faith lived quietly, steadfastly. Many who once dismissed prayer as weakness began to whisper their own petitions at night, inspired by Evelyn's example. For they had seen how prayer had lifted her from the mud to honor, and how silence filled with dignity had silenced pride louder than shouts ever could. Evelyn never reminded the town of her humiliation. She did not need to. Her life had become the reminder, and her prayers continued to be the thread weaving Pine Hill's story into something greater. The seasons turned, carrying Pine Hill from the freshness of spring to the fullness of harvest, yet the memory of those days remained sharp in the minds of its people. The mall became the heartbeat of the town, its doors always open, its walls filled with laughter, commerce, and hope. But more than a place of trade, it stood as a testimony, a monument to the strength of humility and the power of prayer. Caroline visited it often in time, though she no longer walked with the swagger that once defined her. Her steps were measured, her eyes often downcast, and her laughter, when it came, was no longer edged with cruelty, but tinged with softness. Some wondered if she had changed, if the lesson had rooted deeply within her, though only God knew the depth of her heart. Evelyn never shamed her, never reminded her of the day in the mud, for forgiveness had already been spoken, and she left the rest to heaven. The townsfolk, however, never forgot. They told their children and their children's children of the day pride tried to trample dignity, and dignity rose instead. The story passed from lips to ears, woven into the identity of Pine Hill, not as a tale of humiliation, but as a lesson of faith's endurance. Caroline remained in their midst, living quietly, her crown of pride dissolved into dust, while Evelyn walked with a crown unseen, one that neither rust nor moth could destroy. And so the town lived with the memory, carrying it not as a wound, but as a seed, teaching that in every season the humble will be lifted and the proud brought low. For time itself had testified, and Pine Hill bore witness, that prayer is not silence wasted, but the hand that moves mountains and the light that shines even in mud. My dear friends, if there is one thing this story from Pine Hill teaches us, it is this: never measure a person by the clothes they wear, the house they live in, or the wealth they display. Outward appearances can deceive, but the heart tells the truth. Caroline had jewels, gowns, and laughter that cut like glass, yet her pride brought her low. Evelyn wore simple dresses and lived quietly, but her prayers lifted her higher than gold ever could. Remember this: pride is like a heavy chain. It drags the soul down, but humility is like wings. It carries you to places you never imagined. When people mock you, when they push you into the mud, do not waste your strength on anger. Lift your eyes to heaven and pray, for prayer is never wasted. It may look silent, but it shakes mountains in ways the world cannot see. Hold on to faith, walk in humility, and let your heart remain gentle, for in due season, God Himself will lift you up. Now, let us pray together. Wherever you are listening to this story, bow your hearts. Heavenly Father, we thank you for the lesson hidden in this story. We thank you for teaching us that you do not look at the outward appearance, but at the heart. Lord, help us to walk in humility, just as Evelyn did, even when the world tries to shame us. Give us the strength to hold our peace when mocked, to keep our dignity when others laugh, and to turn every tear into a prayer that touches heaven. Father, break every chain of pride in our lives, for pride blinds us, but humility sets us free. We ask that you clothe us in grace, wrap us in your mercy, and crown us with favor that no man can take away. May our enemies see us rise, not by our power, but by your hand. Lift up every listener today, Lord. Where they have been pushed down, lift them higher. Where they have been mocked, restore their honor. Where they have been overlooked, make them a testimony of your faithfulness. We declare that every mud of shame will be turned into a stage of glory, in Jesus' mighty name. And if you believe this prayer, type Amen in the comments, and may the Lord's hand rest upon your life as you do. This brings us to the end of this story. Please don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to my channel, and may God bless you for doing so. Bye.